I was 29 when I realized I'd been settling for mediocre my entire adult life. David and I had been together for 7 years, married for 4. And somewhere along the way, I'd convinced myself that his steady reliability was enough. But watching him get genuinely excited about a new socket wrench set he'd bought for his contracting business, I felt this wave of suffocating boredom wash over me. Here was my husband, practically vibrating with enthusiasm over tools, expecting me to share his excitement about measuring things and fixing other people's problems for a living. Don't get me wrong, David was a good man. Stable income, never forgot anniversaries, helped with dishes without being asked. The kind of husband my mother always said I should appreciate. But good isn't the same as inspiring, and I was tired of pretending that our comfortable routine was fulfilling when I felt like I was slowly disappearing into suburban invisibility. I'd started noticing things more acutely. How he'd dominate dinner conversations with stories about difficult customers and supply chain issues. How he'd fall asleep watching TV every single night, leaving me alone with my thoughts and a growing sense that this couldn't be all there was. Other women had husbands who traveled for business, or discussed books, or at least had opinions about something more stimulating than whether Home Depot or Lowe's had better prices on PVC pipe. That's when Tyler Morrison joined our marketing team at the agency where I worked. The difference was immediate and electric. Where David was predictable, Tyler was spontaneous. Where David talked about practical things, Tyler discussed market psychology and consumer behavior trends that actually challenged my thinking. He had this confidence that came from understanding how the world really worked, not just how to repair it when it broke. Tyler was married too, with 2 kids, which somehow made our connection feel safer, initially. We were just 2 professionals who happened to appreciate each other's intelligence. Nothing wrong with having stimulating conversations with a colleague. Right. David certainly never seemed threatened by my work friendships before, but Tyler was different. He actually listened when I talked about my ideas for campaign strategies, building on my thoughts instead of just waiting for his turn to speak. We'd grab coffee between meetings and I'd find myself laughing more than I had in months. He made me feel witty and insightful in ways David never had. The conversations gradually became more personal. Tyler would mention feeling underappreciated at home, how his wife Jessica seemed more interested in the kids' schedules than in him as a person. I found myself sharing my own frustrations about feeling invisible in my marriage, how David treated me more like a comfortable roommate than a woman he'd chosen to build a life with. Our text exchanges started extending beyond work hours. Nothing inappropriate initially. Just 2 people who enjoyed each other's company staying connected. But I'd find myself checking my phone constantly, feeling more excited about Tyler's messages than anything happening at home. When David would launch into his nightly recap of job site drama, I'd be thinking about something clever Tyler had said earlier, or anticipating our next conversation. The shift happened gradually. Then all at once, Tyler started complimenting me in ways that felt personal rather than professional. He noticed when I wore something new, remembered details about things I'd mentioned weeks earlier. The attention was intoxicating after feeling taken for granted for so long. Then came the message that changed everything. I can't stop thinking about you. This probably crosses a line, but I needed you to know. My heart was racing as I typed back, it crosses a line, but I'm glad you said it. From there, our exchanges became increasingly intimate. We discussed meeting for drinks, then dinner. Then Tyler mentioned knowing about a hotel that was discreet. The planning felt thrilling and terrifying simultaneously. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive. Like I was the main character in my own life instead of a supporting player in David's mundane existence. But I'm not a cheater. I've always prided myself on being honest and direct, even when it's uncomfortable. So instead of sneaking around like most people would do, I decided to have an adult conversation with David about modernizing our relationship. I'd read articles about open marriages in major magazines. Whole communities of people had figured out that monogamy was just an outdated social construct that didn't work for everyone. It wasn't even that radical anymore. Couples were finding ways to honor their primary commitment while acknowledging that human beings are complex creatures with diverse needs. The conversation needed to happen on a night when David was relaxed and receptive. I waited until after dinner, when he was settled in his favorite chair, scrolling through contractor forms on his phone. David, I want to talk to you about something important. He looked up with that mildly attentive expression he got when he thought I was going to discuss household logistics or weekend plans. I've been doing some thinking about our relationship, and I think we should have an open marriage, just temporarily. I'd rehearsed this speech multiple times. I explained how open arrangements were becoming more common among progressive couples, how they could actually strengthen marriages by removing pressure and resentment. It didn't have to be forever, just for a few months while we both explored what we might be missing. David laughed, actually laughed. Like I'd told him a particularly amusing joke. That's a good one. Mel, you almost had me going there. He went back to his phone, completely dismissing what I'd just shared. This was exactly the kind of closed-minded response that had been suffocating me for years. Here I was, trying to communicate honestly about my needs. And he couldn't even take me seriously enough to have a real conversation. I tried explaining again, more earnestly this time. But he just kept chuckling and making jokes about keeping up with the neighbors and what they're teaching people in those magazines. His inability to engage with the concept maturely only confirmed what I already suspected. We'd grown in completely different directions. That was a week before everything exploded. I'd been messaging with Tyler more frequently, making actual plans now. He'd found a hotel about 30 minutes outside town, somewhere we could meet the following Friday evening. The anticipation was incredible. I felt more energetic and optimistic than I had in months, like I was finally taking control of my happiness, instead of just accepting whatever life handed me. Tyler's messages had become increasingly flirtatious. Can't wait for next Friday, and detailed descriptions of what he imagined our evening together might include. Reading them made me feel desired in ways I'd almost forgotten were possible. David barely looked up from his phone most evenings, but Tyler was actively planning romantic encounters and telling me exactly how attractive he found me. I was being careful about our communications, or so I thought. I'd use my laptop when David was busy with work calls or out in the garage organizing his tools. He'd never shown any interest in my computer before. We'd always respected each other's privacy. But apparently that had changed. I came home from work that Thursday evening to find David sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open in front of him. The expression on his face was completely calm, which somehow made it more unsettling than if he'd been angry. "We need to talk," he said quietly. My stomach dropped. The message history with Tyler was right there on the screen. Weeks of increasingly intimate conversations. Our Friday plans. Everything. David, I can explain. Melissa, the answer is no. And we're done talking. His voice was steady, matter of fact. Like he was declining a business proposal rather than responding to a marriage crisis. What do you mean? No, you haven't even listened to what I'm trying to tell you. I've listened plenty. The answer is no. I tried to explain that I hadn't actually done anything yet, that these were just conversations and possibilities, that I'd been trying to handle this honestly by suggesting we open our marriage instead of just sneaking around like most people would do. But David wasn't interested in explanations. He stood up from the table, closed the laptop, and walked toward the hallway closet where we kept extra bedding. "Where are you going? To get a pillow and blanket for the couch?" That's when I realized this wasn't going according to any script I'd imagined. David was supposed to be hurt, maybe angry, but ultimately willing to discuss how we'd gotten to this point, as we were supposed to have a difficult but necessary conversation about the state of our marriage and what we both needed going forward. Instead, he was treating this like a business decision that had already been finalized. The next few days were surreal. David continued going to work, coming home, making dinner, acting perfectly polite but speaking to me only when absolutely necessary. It was like living with a courteous stranger who happened to share my address. I kept trying to initiate conversations about what had happened, but he'd simply say, "We've already discussed this," and walk away. When I pointed out that we hadn't actually discussed anything, that he'd just shut down without giving me a chance to explain my perspective. He'd repeat the same phrase and continue whatever he'd been doing. Tyler stopped responding to my messages entirely. When I tried calling, it went straight to voicemail. I'd gone from having this exciting secret connection to complete radio silence. And David was acting like our 7-year relationship could just be switched off without any negotiation or attempt at resolution. By Tuesday, I was starting to panic. David had made an appointment with someone. He'd mentioned it to me matter-of-factly over breakfast, the way he might mention picking up dry cleaning. When I asked who he was meeting with, he said a lawyer and went back to reading something on his phone. A lawyer. David, don't you think we should try counseling first? Or at least have an actual conversation about what's happening here? We had a conversation. You asked for something. I said no. And now we're dealing with the consequences. His calmness was infuriating. This was our marriage, not some contractor dispute that could be resolved through legal channels. But he seemed determined to treat it like a business transaction that had gone wrong. I spent that day crafting a long email explaining everything, how disconnected I'd been feeling, how the situation with Tyler had developed gradually. how my suggestion about opening our marriage had been an attempt to address our problems honestly rather than just having an affair like most people would do. I wanted David to understand that this wasn't about him not being enough. It was about me needing to explore parts of myself that had been dormant during our years together. But when I tried to send it, I discovered he'd blocked my email address. Same with my phone number. My texts were turning green and going undelivered. This was getting ridiculous. We lived in the same house? For crying out loud. What kind of person blocks their own wife instead of having an adult conversation about their relationship problems? I started reaching out to mutual friends, hoping someone could help David understand that he was overreacting. But the responses I got were strange and uncomfortable. My friend Sarah, who usually loved getting involved in other people's drama, was suddenly very busy and couldn't meet for coffee. When I finally caught her at the grocery store, she was polite but distant, like she was talking to an acquaintance rather than someone she'd known for years. "Sarah, I really need to talk to someone about what's happening with David and me. I'm sure you'll work it out," she said, avoiding eye contact while examining pasta sauce labels with unusual intensity. "We're not working anything out. That's the problem. He won't even discuss it. Maybe that's for the best right now." There was something in her tone that made me realize she knew more than she was letting on. David had clearly been talking to people, presenting his version of events without giving me any opportunity to explain what had actually happened. That's when I understood how calculated this whole thing was. David wasn't just hurt and reacting emotionally, he was systematically destroying my support network while maintaining his image as the wronged party. The realization hit me on Friday afternoon when I was called into a conference room after our weekly marketing meeting. I thought it was about the campaign presentation I'd just given. Maybe some feedback or additional assignments. Instead, there was a man in a cheap suit holding an envelope. "Are you Melissa Chen?" "Yes, but I'm at work right now." "So if this is about insurance or something, you're being served with divorce papers." The room went silent. My colleagues, who'd been gathering their materials and chatting about weekend plans, suddenly found their phones extremely interesting. I could feel their discomfort and curiosity radiating around me as I took the envelope with shaking hands. There must be some mistake. We haven't even discussed divorce. But the man was already leaving, and I was standing there holding legal documents that made it clear David had been planning this for days. While I'd been trying to figure out how to repair our communication breakdown, he'd been meeting with attorneys and filing paperwork. The humiliation was overwhelming. These were people I worked with every day. And now they'd witnessed me being served with divorce papers like I was some kind of deadbeat who'd been avoiding legal responsibilities. I drove home in a daze, expecting to find David there so we could finally have the conversation we should have had a week ago. Instead, the house was empty except for a note on the kitchen counter. "Staying at my brother's. Contact my attorney with any questions." That's when I called Tyler, desperate to talk to someone who understood what I'd been going through. But Jessica answered his phone. "I know who this is," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "I know exactly who this is. And if you ever contact my husband again, I'll make sure everyone in this town knows what kind of person you really are." She hung up before I could explain that Tyler and I hadn't actually done anything, that we'd just been talking and maybe flirting a little, which was completely normal for adults who happened to connect intellectually. But apparently David had contacted Jessica directly, sending her screenshots of our message conversations. She'd confronted Tyler, and according to the gossip network that small towns thrive on, it hadn't gone well for him. The next weekend, Jessica made a scene at their kids' soccer game. Right there in front of all the other parents and children, she started yelling at Tyler about his emotional affair and how he'd been planning to cheat on his family. Tyler's life imploded faster than our marriage had, and suddenly he was being transferred to another branch while Jessica filed for divorce and custody of their children. When I heard about the soccer game confrontation through Sarah's sister, who'd witnessed the whole thing, I was horrified. This was exactly the kind of public drama I'd been trying to avoid by suggesting we handle everything maturely and privately. I confronted David when he came by to pick up more clothes. "Are you happy now? You've ruined 2 families instead of just having an adult conversation about our problems." He looked at me with that same calm expression he'd been wearing for weeks. "You ruined 2 families. I just made sure nobody missed the show." The coldness in his voice was devastating. This wasn't the man I'd married. The one who used to bring me coffee in bed and laugh at my terrible jokes. David had become someone calculating and vengeful, determined to punish me for being honest about my needs, instead of just lying and sneaking around like most people would have done. The divorce proceedings moved faster than I'd thought possible. David's attorney was apparently some kind of bulldog who specialized in cases where one spouse had been betrayed. Never mind that I hadn't actually cheated. The message history with Tyler was being treated like evidence of an affair. And my suggestion about opening our marriage was being presented as proof that I'd already checked out of our relationship. I tried explaining to my own attorney that David was the one who'd refused to communicate, who'd shut down every attempt at honest conversation about our problems. But she kept asking practical questions about assets and debts instead of focusing on the real issues. He's being vindictive because I bruised his ego, I told her. This whole thing could have been avoided if he'd just been willing to discuss modernizing our relationship like other couples do. She looked at me over her reading glasses with an expression I was getting tired of seeing. Mrs. Chen, the court isn't interested in relationship philosophy. We need to focus on division of property and financial responsibilities. That's when I learned that David was keeping most of our assets, including the house, while I was getting stuck with the debt from our kitchen remodel. Apparently, his business income and contribution to our down payment years ago gave him more claim to our shared property than my salary and 4 years of making our house a home. The unfairness was staggering. I was being punished financially for David's inability to handle mature conversations about marriage, while he got to keep everything we'd built together and play the victim to anyone who'd listen. By the time our divorce was finalized, I'd lost most of our mutual friends, my comfortable living situation, and a significant portion of my financial security. I moved into a small apartment across town, the kind of place I hadn't lived in since my early 20s, while David stayed in our house with all our furniture and wedding gifts. The social isolation was almost worse than the financial impact. People who'd known us as a couple were clearly taking sides, and it wasn't my side. At work, colleagues who used to chat with me about weekend plans were suddenly very busy whenever I approached. The few friends who'd remained neutral were uncomfortable discussing anything related to my personal life, like I'd become radioactive. Tyler had been transferred to a branch in another state, so there wasn't even the possibility of maintaining the connection that had started this whole mess. Jessica had made sure everyone knew about our affair, despite the fact that we'd never actually met outside of work or done anything more than exchange messages. But in a small town, the appearance of impropriety was apparently equivalent to actually cheating. Dating was a nightmare. The apps were full of men who seemed to think a recently divorced woman was desperate enough to accept whatever attention they offered. The few decent prospects inevitably asked what had ended my marriage. And there was no way to explain the situation without sounding either like a cheater or like someone whose husband had left her for no reason. Months passed before I worked up the courage to reach out to David directly. I'd had time to process what had happened. And I thought maybe he'd be ready to have the conversation we should have had at the beginning. I started with text messages. I miss you. I know things got complicated, but we had 7 good years together. We can fix this if we both want to. The messages showed as delivered but never as read. After a week of silence, I tried calling, but it went straight to voicemail. Finally, I decided to approach him at his work site. I brought coffee, the specific blend he used to love from that place downtown, and one of those sandwiches he always ordered when we'd go there for lunch during happier times. David was talking to one of his employees when I arrived, discussing some issue with a commercial account. He looked good, better than he had during the last months of our marriage. Actually, relaxed and confident in a way I hadn't seen in years. David, can we please just talk for 5 minutes? He glanced at me, then at the coffee and sandwich I was holding like peace offerings. Melissa, you asked for temporary, now you got permanent. That's not fair. You never gave us a chance to work through anything. You just decided we were done without even trying. But he was already turning away, nodding to his employees who were suddenly surrounding me in a way that made it clear I needed to leave. Ma'am, you need to go, one of them said, not unkindly but firmly. The humiliation of being escorted away from David's job site by his workers was almost unbearable. Here I was, trying to salvage something from the relationship we'd built together. And he couldn't even show me the courtesy of a private conversation. That was over a year ago now. I still see David occasionally around town. It's impossible to avoid someone completely in a place this size. He drives a new truck now, and I've heard through the gossip network that his business is thriving. 3 new commercial accounts, a 2nd truck, 2 additional employees. He looks happy in a way that's both gratifying and infuriating. Meanwhile, I'm still in the same small apartment, still dealing with the debt from our kitchen remodel, still trying to rebuild a social life from scratch. I got laid off 6 months ago when the agency downsized, so now I'm freelancing and barely covering my expenses. The dating situation hasn't improved. Men my age are either divorced with complicated custody situations, or have never been married for reasons that become apparent quickly. The younger ones are looking for fun, not relationships. And the older ones seem to think I should be grateful for any attention at all. Sometimes I run into people who knew us as a couple, and they're polite but distant, like they're not sure what to say to me anymore. I've become the cautionary tale, the woman who threw away a good marriage for reasons they don't fully understand but definitely disapprove of. What bothers me most is how the whole situation has been rewritten in everyone's minds. David is the stable, hardworking guy who got betrayed by his ungrateful wife. I'm the selfish woman who wanted to have her cake and eat it too. Nobody talks about his refusal to communicate or his vindictive approach to our divorce. Nobody mentions that I was trying to address our problems, honestly, instead of just cheating like most people would have done. I still think about Tyler sometimes, wondering what might have happened if we'd been able to meet that Friday evening as planned. Would it have been worth all this chaos? Would we have discovered something real and lasting? Or would it have just been a temporary distraction from my dissatisfaction with suburban life? There's no way to know now. Tyler's living in another state, presumably trying to rebuild his relationship with his children and repair the damage to his own life. I'm here, starting over at 31, trying to figure out how to create the kind of life I actually want, instead of just accepting whatever feels safe and conventional. I don't regret wanting more from my marriage. I don't regret recognizing that David and I had grown apart or that we wanted different things from life. What I regret is believing that honesty and direct communication would be enough to navigate such a complicated situation. If I could do it over again, I'm not sure I'd change my actions as much as my expectations. I thought David would be mature enough to discuss opening our relationship, even if he ultimately decided against it. I thought our 7 years together had earned me at least a conversation about what we both needed going forward. Instead, I learned that some people would rather destroy everything than admit that their relationship might need to evolve. David chose scorched earth over compromise, and now we're both living with the consequences of that choice. The irony is that I'm probably happier now than I was during those last months of our marriage, despite all the practical difficulties. I'm not spending my evenings listening to stories about pipe fittings and difficult customers. I'm not pretending to be satisfied with a life that felt too small for who I was becoming. But I'm also not building toward anything with someone who truly understands me, the way I thought Tyler and I might have been able to do. I'm just existing day to day, trying to create something meaningful from the pieces that are left. Maybe that's enough for now. Maybe this is what personal growth actually looks like. Not the romantic adventure I'd imagined with Tyler, but the slow, difficult work of building a life that's authentically mine instead of just comfortable and socially acceptable. David got to keep our old life. With all its routines and assumptions intact, I got the chance to start over completely, which is both terrifying and liberating in ways I'm still learning to appreciate.